So it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to the list this evening. Thank you for coming. I'm very pleased to have this opportunity of this panel to really engage the outstanding work presented in our exhibition, Alan Uglow, Standards and Portraits, both to give us some time to reflect on the artist's practice and its sort of specificity, but also to get into some of the things that often stand behind or between or if it doesn't go well, in front of exhibitions. And often a big part of organizing or curating a show is both the interesting differential between where you start and where you end, and then the kind of post-mortem where you realize what you tried to do and failed at doing, and what you didn't try to do but will take credit for. This gives us this interstitial moment, which is to reflect on a practice that in the exhibition, I think, is presented in a way that does also call for a bit of reflection. As you might know, if you had a chance to see the show, the exhibition is comprised of two, and only two, of several series of Uglow's works, his standard paintings and the portraits of a standard, both which really are centered on, and I think are a great reflection on, his decades-long investigation into the medium of painting and particular conditions and issues that both stretch back to the origins of painting as a medium, but also are very specific to a kind of narrative of post-war abstraction, which we'll get into this evening. Uglow's work, in its specificity and its particularity, is marked by a keen sense of proportion, of structure, of form, and surface, which I think is particularly evident in the standard paintings. And working in series that evolved gradually over these decades, he maintained an abiding focus on a very strict and at the same time very poetic formal economy, using very simple geometrical shapes to structure the surface of his canvases and emphasizing the materiality of painting rather than any direct pictorial content. Again, these two series, which are associated with each other, they were as such in their production and have been since in their exhibition history, they reflect a commitment to exploring both the very formal historical conditions of painting, but also in particular their affective and perceptual conditions. We often don't relate those two things together and maybe associate a certain kind of affect, emotionality, sentimentality, or poetry with one particular kind of painting, let's say figuration, and see abstraction as a often purely intellectual, ideational, conceptual exercise, by its definition supposedly underscored by a conceptual aridity and a lack of visual pleasure. And certainly the body is as a site of perception and of pleasure, is often thought of as not being involved or particular to the experience of abstraction. I think that's also something we'll discuss this evening. And so in being seemingly reductive in form, his work actually is executed with great sort of deliberation. In the instance of the standard paintings, with up to 40 layers of paint. This slow and determined process creates delicate nuances of surface, such that the paintings really very subtly play with light, reflection, and our own perception in space. Again, the phenomenological experience of the body as central to the process of abstraction, and therefore linked to a certain sensuality, again, that we often do not associate with abstraction and see firmly placed in representational work or in figurative work. These kinds of distinctions, which I think are in a sense on the surface, both materially and metaphorically, produce a great sense of pictorial space without traditional perspective or illusion, which again I think is central to his interest in abstraction. They also confront the problem of the edge and the literal nature of the painting. The edge as a kind of running theme through the history of 20th century abstraction, from its more obvious, in its more obvious forms in, say, the painting of Mondrian or Frank Stella, to its sort of negative forms in Rothko and Pollock. A very young, very cocky Frank Stella made much of Pollock's failure of creating a properly overall or all over composition, that Pollock's great struggle was that when he got to the edge, he circled back. And so even this great explosion of energetic freedom in painting was always bounded by the canvas and the conditions of the canvas. And this became for Stella the central point of investigation in painting in the early 1960s, after making precisely these kinds of slightly softer, slightly gestural kinds of abstractions. Uglow, in a sense, ramps this up also by taking a very particular stance on the objectness of the painting in terms of its presentation. So the paintings are installed on blocks and sited in precise relation to the wall and surrounding space. He sketched this out in very precise detail. Both the placement of the blocks in relationship to the constructed elements of the painting, but also the angle and space away from the wall through which they sit. So there's an articulation of the whole object itself, asserting a kind of physicality, such that the paintings work both as images and as objects. They go back and forth between being an object and being an image. This itself is returning to a kind of problem in painting, which is really a Renaissance problem, which is the painting as a window. And a painting is a window at the same time as it is a thing, a flat thing on the wall. It's, I think, to his great credit to make this visually interesting and centrally interesting, rather than just a dry academic problem, which it often is and can be. And he does so, I think, through a refinement of shape, texture, and ground. This problem is revisited, and I think further problematized in the portraits, or portraits of a standard, which are photographic silkscreen prints on canvas that capture the paintings at an oblique angle, as if to, in a sense, recede into physical space. They further an interest in repetition, difference, and objecthood, or I think better put, the difference in repetition, that perceptual trick, that something that seems the same is in fact perceptually different. And the attempt to create a perfect reproduction of something often leads you into an interesting point of slippage. My sort of more charming anecdote about that is a story about Agnes Martin, who one can imagine the practice of Martin being an artist I don't think we will discuss this evening, but you can imagine Agnes Martin sitting there and very deliberately making these very controlled marks. And she was once asked what she thought about when she did this. And I think the expectation was that she would have some grand Zen-like prophetic meditational answer. And she said, I think about English teacups. And then proceeded to draw a map of directions from her studio to the next surrounding town, which she did with an incredibly trembling, shaking hand. The portraits themselves, Uglow's portraits themselves, are of identical dimension to the paintings and also displayed on blocks, I think both to suggest a certain idea of objectness or objecthood, but also to solve a very practical problem, which is how do you move these things around, and why do people always want to hang these paintings? So while the structural elements of color and edge are, in a sense, blurred, the very present things in the paintings are blurred, the portraits themselves suggest yet another edge, and that is the edge, the perpetual edge since the late 19th century, the edge between painting and photography. And to discuss these aspects, perhaps none of them, perhaps some more interesting, we're really pleased to be joined by a rather remarkable group. And I'm going to introduce them in their speaking order. They'll come and present, and then we will have a conversation, and then open up the questions. Our first speaker is Gregory Williams. I'm very happy to say, I would say a friend of the Liss Center at this point, who is assistant professor in the Department of History of Art and Architecture at Boston University, and received a PhD in art history from the Graduate Center, City University of New York. In addition to serving as an editor-at-large at Brooklyn's Cabinet Magazine, he regularly publishes in art periodicals such as Art Forum, Frieze, Texte zur Kunst, and others. He has authored catalog essays for major exhibitions of Rosemary Trockel at the Museum Ludwig in Cologne in 2005, and actually a traveling show that was also in the Kunstmuseum Basel and in Wiels. Martin Kimpenberger for the Tate retrospective in 2006. His essay, A Glossier Shade of Brown, Imi Knobel's Raum 19, appeared as a chapter in Regarding the Popular, Modernism, the Avant-Garde, and High and Low Culture. I think Knobel is an interesting figure to think about in relationship to Uglow. For the winter 2012 issue of Art Journal, Williams has written Ground Control, Painting in the Work of Cosima von Bohnen. His work, Permission to Laugh, Humor and Politics in Contemporary German Art, two things that you don't necessarily associate with each other, appeared in 2012 with the University of Chicago Press. Professor Williams teaches lecture courses and seminars at the undergraduate and graduate levels in modern and contemporary art and critical theory. He is the recipient of several fellowships and awards, including a Fulbright Fellowship, a grant from the Berlin Program for Advanced German and European Studies, which is why I ran into him in 3 German cities in 1 week, a faculty research visiting grant from the German Academic Exchange Service of the DAAD, a postdoctoral fellowship by the Getty Foundation, and the Frank and Lynn Wisniewski Award for Excellence in Teaching at Boston University. Our second speaker is Alina Alexander, who is a poet and writer. She was married to and on occasion collaborated with Alan Uglow. And their relationship, as she likes to say, was 33 1/3 years long, which is the speed of a long playing record. Miss Alexander was a special lecturer for the New Jersey Institute of Technology from 2003 to 2010, and an adjunct at Rutgers, Newark from 2005 to 2008. Though primarily a writer of poems, hybrid prose, and fiction, she authored and edited Footnotes, 6 choreographers inscribe the page, published by Routledge in 1998. Which is part of the series Critical Voices in Art, Theory, and Culture. During the 1990s, she was guest lecturer and panelist for the Ewald, did I say that right? Yeah, Ewald Scholars Symposium, Sweetbriar College. A panelist and reader for New York University's Poetry and Collaboration, New York City Poetry Talks. A panelist for the New York Foundation for the Arts, Culture Counts program. And in 2002, she sat on a granting panel for the Jerome Foundation in St. Paul. Her short story, Sick Transit, received honorable mention in Prize Stories, the O. Henry Awards, Best of 1997, and her poem, How the Lurking, was chosen by a consortium of 4 arts organizations in response to 9/11, made into a poster and displayed on walls in Manhattan and I think all 5 boroughs.
4 boroughs, not Staten Island, but also Florence, Italy.
Which is not a borough of Manhattan. Her work has appeared in anthologies published by Henry Holt, New York University Press, Penguin and Serpent's Tail, and various literary magazines. Selections of her poetry and prose have been translated into Serb, Croat, and Slovenian. And 3 of her poems actually currently appear in Bomb magazine in the spring issue of 2013. And she's currently at work on the hybrid prose text, The Dead Artist's Artist Wife. And our last speaker is Stephen Ellis, who has shown his paintings in numerous galleries in the United States and Europe since 1982. Ellis has been associated with a group of American artists, including Jonathan Lasker, Lydia Donna, Terry Winters, David Reed, Philip Taff, and Chris Wool, who beginning in the late 70s rebelled against the self-referential formalism theorized by Clement Greenberg and returned abstraction to an engagement with the world. I think that explains why he's here. Ellis has written about art for numerous magazines, including Parquet and Art in America, where he was an associate editor from 1989 through 1992. During the mid-'80s, while living in Cologne, Germany, Ellis wrote extensively on the work of Gerhard Richter, Martin Kippenberger, and Albert Oerlin. These articles were some of the earliest coverage in the American press on the work of these artists. Most recently, he has written about the paintings of Giorgio Morandi, Dan Walsh, and Alan Uglow. Since the early 1980s, Ellis has taught at various art schools and universities, including Cooper Union, SVA, MICA in Baltimore, New York University Bard College, and Harvard University. Ellis' painting and graphic work is represented in public and private collections in the United States and Europe. He's been the recipient of awards, including the New York Foundation for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Arts, the American Academy and the Institute of Arts and Letters, and the Joan Mitchell Foundation. His work is included in Feiden's Recent History of Contemporary Painting, Painting Today, edited by Tony Godfrey. So we'll start our event tonight with Greg Williams. Thank you.
Evening. Thank you very much, Joao, and thanks to Ellis also for organizing the event, for inviting me. I should probably start by saying among the panelists tonight, I'm the one who's definitively the furthest removed from both the work of Alan Uglow and the man himself. And so what I'm trying to do tonight, I was trying to come up with a focused way to offer some remarks in the span of about 10 minutes. And rather than do something more broadly historical, I thought it would be a good opportunity to really try to come up with some language to describe my own experience of seeing the work upstairs, because frankly, this is really one of the first times I've had the chance to see an extensive number of works in a really well-lit, well-installed situation. Most works I've seen have been, I think I've seen 2 or 3 of his works in person, frankly, in group shows in New York in the late 1990s. And I did have a little bit of direct contact with him. I worked in a nonprofit space in Tribeca called Apex Art in the mid to late 90s, and he used to come by there on a semi-regular basis, and I do remember having a few conversations with him. As I know Stephen and Alina will both remark, he was a persona, he was a presence. People recognized him in the neighborhood, and I knew who he was fairly quickly just from sight. And I think that says something about his presence in New York for many years. And so I'm honored to be able to think more deeply about his work. But this is really just a sort of first attempt, and it's really more focused on what is upstairs. So let's see, am I on to the, yeah, great. Alan Uglow counts among the international artists who remained enthralled with the formal rigor of geometric abstract painting at a moment when it did not receive extensive critical attention. They pursued these aims in the 1970s and 80s when the dominant trends, video, performance, body art, conceptual art, land art, etc., definitively rejected the seemingly closed, inwardly directed orientation of abstract painting, not to mention the general suspicion in many quarters of painting as a discipline. Uglow quietly developed his standard and Portrait of a Standard series during the boisterous years of the culture wars, in which many artists prioritized physicality, transgression, and social engagement over formal contemplation. Working against the tide, Uglow crafted clean pictures organized according to a strict logic and visible structure. Each standard, which he began producing in 1992, and this is the first one, and some of my language is actually going to overlap with some of your language, so we didn't read each other's talks in advance, consists of straight horizontal and vertical lines painted mostly along the edges or across the center of the canvas. Short tabs interrupt the surface at intervals, slightly disturbing the sense of equilibrium conveyed by the rectangles resting on top of one another. And in this one, you can see that the tabs are only just beginning to emerge. Those I think we'll see later. They appeared in earlier works in a more visible way. Various degrees of transparency and opacity are also discernible when closely observed, as Uglow built up his surfaces with dozens of layers of paint. The resulting works are austere, rational, and appear to be motivated by a deadly seriousness. Yet to dismiss his work as anachronistic and removed from the concerns of his time would be to ignore the ways in which Uglow's paintings establish a liminal space between embodiment and detachment. In the right lighting, and it should be noted that installation requires sensitivity and patience, as we talked about at the opening, the viewer becomes conscious of his or her movements in front of the works, whose surfaces quickly transform with only slight shifts in positioning. The initial impression of coldness and consistency gives way to a more dynamic interaction with flashes of warmth and unpredictability as the paint both reflects and absorbs the light. Perhaps most crucial to the visual experience, the majority of the standard paintings lean against the wall, propped up on 2 small blocks of wood. Even without this overt acknowledgement of their status as physical objects, the paint typically wraps around the edges of the surface like strips of tape to call attention to the sides of the canvas support. Uglow thus stands in a line of painters, from Piet Mondrian through Frank Stella to Blinky Palermo, who upset the singular focus on opticality by lending their works a resolutely tactile quality. Artists of Uglow's own generation, those born in the 1940s, also come to mind and include, and these are some lesser known artists perhaps than the figures I just mentioned, Helmut Federle, a Swiss artist based for many years in Vienna, Joseph Marioni, an American artist based for a long time in New York and known for these paintings, usually simply called white painting, green painting, red painting, etc., where the surface seems to be fairly consistently treated, except for the bottoms where you see these drip marks. And Emi Knöbel, a German artist based since the 1960s in Dusseldorf and Cologne. He was a student of Joseph Beuys in the mid to late 1960s. I'm just going to show you briefly 3 works of his. All 4 of these artists were brought together in an exhibition at the Sammlung Götz in Munich in 1996, and this is where I'm getting these reproductions. In my opinion, Knöbel's work offers the most compelling point of comparison in its oscillation between painting as surface and painting as thing. And this is something I agree with you, I think we could bring up maybe in the conversation. After experimenting with his own approach throughout the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, around 2000, and here are a couple of works from the mid-1980s, Sign of 1985, and Palma of 1988. Around 2000, Uglow added another degree of reflexivity with his portrait of a standard series. For these works, he photographed the standard paintings at an oblique angle. I'm using exactly your language here, and silkscreened the images onto canvas. Likewise placed on wood blocks, the portraits seem to withdraw from view, even as one recognizes that both series rely on the same support structure. At the list and in past exhibitions, works from these 2 series are shown within relatively close proximity. The result is both revealing and concealing. On the one hand, the quasi-doubling effect suggests that these painting objects stick to a loose formula and are thus repeatable, reproducible. On the other, the shift of focus from a standard to a portrait entails being distracted by the latter from the surface so sensitively handled in the former. The eyes dart back and forth between the objects in a closed-circuit viewing experience that does not allow the gaze to settle upon a single target. This arrangement allows the paintings to remain self-sufficient in a way that eludes works by artists such as Peter Halley, whose circuits are primarily composed of forms that function as signs for real-world processes. At the same time, as writers such as Stephen Ellis and Bob Nickas have noted, Uglow often exhibited photographs stemming from his passion for soccer or football alongside the paintings. These are 2 from the same year, roughly the same time he begins the portrait series. His photos of soccer stadiums and team benches implied that the mute paintings could reach outward to connect with everyday, warm-blooded, tactile events. This is Uglow's moment of transgression, to suggest that geometric abstraction might need to insist upon anything more than its formal and material properties. Although certainly not meant to appear as analog representations of sport field layouts, the standards do often contain 2 dominant rectangular halves that translate roughly to the 2 sides of a football pitch, but also set up an internal opposition. Considering the paintings and the photographs together, one gets the sense that formal abstraction was never quite enough for Uglow on its own terms. Or, perhaps better, he recognized, as many painters have before him, even if they did not admit it, that no abstract image is experienced entirely without reference to external reality, and, more provocatively, that all abstract images ultimately derive from some preceding visual source, whether or not it is consciously acknowledged. And that could be another topic for discussion. The oblique angle of his portrait pictures might relate to Uglow's own position in the New York art world, a subtly critical artist who realized that embodiment does not necessarily require the direct depiction of bodies. And what I want to do with just the brief moments I have still, this is the written part. I have 4 topics for conversation I would like to offer up, around 4 categories that have come to mind as I've been thinking about this event. And the first is along the lines of spatiality, the spatial. And I want to think about the idea of disorientation in relation to his work. In looking at the show, I was immediately thinking about this essay that's been cited quite a bit, came out, I think, 7 years ago, or a little longer, David Zwirner's painting Beside Itself, in which you kind of have a literal enactment of that process with these works standing in relationship to each other. And then, of course, recently there was the conference at Harvard. Some of you may have attended, Painting Beyond Itself, and there are multiple metaphors of space and spatiality and a kind of crisis of space in and out of painting in much of the recent critical literature. what we might think of in terms of Uglow's work as a kind of troubled reflexivity. The second category would be cognitive, and that relates to the idea of distraction, the effect of shifting one's gaze both across the surface of the individual works and between them, and that's this kind of pivot one does when looking between two of the works, and actually when you see the show as a whole with some of the sight lines that are set up, it's really pivoting around the room, which one does, of course, anyway, but I think he has this way of keeping you moving back and forth, maybe like a tennis match, which is yet another sport metaphor to throw in. Now, sort of thinking categorically, this is a much bigger topic and one that would take a longer conversation, but we can get into it a little bit tonight, and that is his dialogue with history, the extent to which he was, on the one hand, working in peripheral relation to the main concerns of his time, while recognizing that abstract painting is always self-conscious of its historical position. And finally, the theme of otherness, the idea of difference that João also alluded to. I want to think of a kind of optical swivel, this sort of movement back and forth, the mobile gaze, as a metaphor to think about Uglow's later works, how they operate on the boundary between abstraction and reference. One is constantly harassed or distracted by the other work in close proximity. Final point might be to just say why these works feel so fresh and relevant today, and to make another reference to the space outside of the painting. I think they make us think, make me think, and especially as I spent time with them, of the idea, how this idea of distraction relates to, say, digital technologies and the way we view screens, and so that the canvas surface could also be seen as a kind of screen. It's a fairly obvious point to make, but I think one that's worth unpacking a little bit, and maybe it's more of a comfortable process to go back and forth today in a time where our eyes are constantly darting back and forth across screens and between them. The rest I'll leave for conversation later. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, thank you for coming. Am I on? Can you hear me? Okay, my mic's on. And my thanks to João so much for organizing this, curating this, and to Ellis, who is here helping me because I am so technologically challenged I can't read and click a button at the same time. So, okay. I just want to point out before I forget, you showed a signal. It's actually a diptych. Well, we can discuss that later, but I did want to say. I thought that was a wonderful talk, though. Thank you. Okay. Having grappled with several approaches to discussing Alan Uglow's work in the current exhibition at MIT's List Visual Arts Center, I will focus on two aspects or meanings of framing. The first is in the context of standard paintings and portrait of a standard silkscreens, hereafter referred to as standards and portraits. I'll begin by making a distinction between edge and frame in relation to Uglow's work, since he played with both from earliest paintings to last. First, edge. When I initially encountered the work in 1977, his solution to what happens at the left side of a 7 by 6 foot canvas was often the application of off-white thinly cut masking tape or thinly applied paint, similar in tone to the tape. These horizontal marks, placed slightly to the right of this left edge, were analogous to those found on rulers, yet here used to impart not reliable measurement, but a sense of proportion. Near the right side of the canvas could be found a thin, slightly curved painted line near top to near bottom, either white or white infused. The tops and bottoms received similar attention. They were addressed and resolved. That was this artist dealing with edge. It was edgy in its subtlety and subtle in the work's overall oil-painted, multi-layered whites. If seen only from the front, the surface could appear empty and uninflected. The gradations, however, painted over and under one another, ask that the viewer move his or her own body from one side of the canvas to the other in order to gain purchase on these multiple inflections, a quiet and rewarding game. In contradistinction, the standards, which also reward if one moves about the room, are obviously framed, if what we mean by frame in the visual arts is often the bounded defining of a painted or photographic space. The standards show the viewer a distinct and apparent color all the way around a 7 by 6 foot canvas. Though no two framing colors are the same, every frame around each standard approximates 3.8 centimeters or 1.5 inches. These frames consistently border a white space, and though that white shifts tonally from standard to standard according to the surrounding color, it is intended to be smooth, if not necessarily uniform in depth. This is because although the aggregate internal structure is similar from one standard to another, the paintings play with a set of permutations. What is identical and unarguable is the installation of all standards and portraits. Each one is set on consistently sized wooden blocks, placed always in the same relation to the object atop them. The back bottom edge of all standards and portraits is 8 centimeters from the wall, which means they all lean, as Joao said, at a predetermined angle. I won't say any more about the internal information found in the paintings. They require being seen. What I will address is the contradiction between frame and space, because although the frame does bound it, it does not, in fact, ultimately contain the space. Space has the final say. Whether top and bottom or side to side, the internal white expanse in each and all standards extends beyond the framing color, tacitly expressing this space. Even their installation, as mentioned, creates space behind the work. They were, after all, produced by a man who loved to be on the move, finding the open space, whether playing football, soccer here in the US, or slipping quickly and seemingly effortlessly through the crowded streets of our Chinatown neighborhood in New York City. Now, the second aspect of framing. We frame the artist himself or herself, and in so doing, do what frames have always done: capture, hold, and, while gaining and focusing our attention, limit the scope of what we might otherwise see. Much has been made of, for instance, Uglow's 30 to 40 layers of paint, as well as his affection for the work of Alberto Giacometti. What does this information mean? What might we be missing if these become biographical mantras? In moving to the United States from Great Britain, Uglow exited a tradition of patience and entered a culture of speed. Traditions can be both punishing and tempering. In Uglow's case, layering meant laboring, and laboring meant honoring the tradition of work, which meant enough to this artist that he felt he didn't deserve to breathe if he didn't put in a full day every day in the studio. As for Giacometti, simply because Uglow himself painted work lacking recognizable humans doesn't mean his work is not intensely aware of and sensitive to, as Greg pointed out, human scale. At times he spoke of certain work he'd made as being like bodies. There are even, however few, some overtly figurative drawings in the darkest recesses of the flat file. Shh, you've heard it. Keep it to yourself. But the larger point is this. What would seem surprising would be a lack of appreciation for Giacometti's work. I don't personally know of any non-objective or committedly abstract artists, especially of a certain age, who don't have images of figurative work in their studios. This usually takes the form of postcards. It could be Caravaggio, Piero, van de Weyden, Grunewald, Vermeer. It could be all of them and yet more. That list of men is, of course, at a safely temporal safely temporal remove. They provide, if anything, the bar, the inspiration, the ongoing dialogue with the living and the so-called dead implicit in art making. It is also an exclusively male list. I will now leap through centuries and land Doctor Who-like, returning to the 21st, where one still hears from time to time, painting is dead. When this position first gained agency, it was the 1960s and 70s, and a rather aggressive throwing down of a gauntlet, a kind of warrior stance, and this during anti-war demonstrations protesting imperialism. But not to get sidetracked, then was then, now is now. In that earlier era, a female voice asserted itself, ornery and at times insulting to her male colleagues. She argued for painting's continued pulse and healthy heartbeat. And it is this woman's paintings and politics Uglow admired and was, in his early days, influenced by, having read about her and seen images of her work before his arrival in the US. I'll just say as an aside, he came here for 3 weeks in 1968 and moved to the United States in 1969, just to clarify that. It's not that she had never been mentioned in relationship to him, but receives far less attention than, say, Mondrian, Malevich, Newman, Ryman, Palermo, all of whom engaged Uglow's eyes and thoughts at one time or another. But this woman had a kind of staying power for him, in my opinion. Before full disclosure, which I assure you will be anticlimactic, a brief anecdote. On a trip to England in the late 80s, Alan was visited by a woman with whom he'd gone to art school but hadn't seen for decades. She told him she would have dropped out of school had it not been for him. He was shocked. He was very surprised, I'll say this, he really was. Many of the teachers in those days awaited each new season's crop of females, separating the juicy and robust from the weaker strains, and the students, male, with very rare exception, merely ignored the work of any who were not also male. Shunning is terrible punishment. It never occurred to Alan to do this, to attach seriousness of purpose and ability to gender. He repeatedly spoke with this female student about her work. I'm not mentioning her name out of respect for privacy. I mean, I was there and I knew who this was. And having said that, who is the mystery woman who gets shorter shrift than the men? No mystery, Joe Bear. And also, if you put those other two, yeah. Okay, now this is a painting from about 1965. This is Alan still in London. I mean, it was, yeah, I mean, well, I'll say more about his relationship to other artists when we sit and discuss. And go one more if you would. Okay, that's the early work. Thanks, thank you. To go back within the frame to Giacometti, why is it surprising that a non-objective painter would pay attention to and grasp, with no small amount of understanding, the struggle to materially externalize internal tensions, a sensation apparent in Giacometti, resolving itself in a contradictory sense of space moving outward while at the same time compressing. As was said of Alan Uglow by one of the speakers at his memorial, and here I quote, "His work has the ability to simultaneously calm and excite." I'm going to give the final words here to another female artist, the painter Medry McPhee, who, writing about Uglow for the Brooklyn Rail, said, this was after Alan's death, "Alan was bluntly honorable. I don't know if it was an extension of his sportsman's code of fair play, but I experienced it firsthand in the mid-90s at the gallery where we both showed. Alan was unfailingly generous and supportive. He respected women. An authentic human being, Alan pursued his passions with enthusiasm and was not interested in the life at court aspect of the art world. He lived his moment on the planet to the fullest, with all the attendant missteps, self-destructive behavior, and regrets that anyone with a taste for risk and total commitment to his calling experiences." That was one of the last paintings. No, it wasn't. It was penultimate paintings made. Thank you so much.
Can you hear me? I'm the cartoon. After all of this very intricate analysis, I'm going to talk about something a little less complicated in the intellectual sense anyway, but perhaps complicated in a different way. Painting makes one very aware of how the same ideas in the hands of two different artists can either be thrilling or utterly dead. I think of, for example, the difference between Mondrian's paintings and Van Doesburg's. If you're a big Van Doesburg fan, I apologize. Or between Watteau and Lancret. Because of their apparent simplicity, I think Alan's paintings confront that issue, bring that issue to mind immediately when you first look at them. I believe Gregory was talking about the initial experience of something kind of cold and lifeless, immediately followed by a wait, there's something else going on. And then the paintings began to open up, slowly at first and then more rapidly. They have to be seen in context and in real life, I mean, which is why I like to leave this image up for a while, because it does give you some sense of the peculiar glow that his paintings have. So this reminds me of a very ancient joke, which I'm sure you've all heard, and so I'll tell it in a sort of abbreviated way. But a guy is convicted of murder and sent to the prison for lifers. And he arrives, and they're all in the cafeteria in line. And one shouts, 78, and they all break up. And then there's a pause, and someone says, 16, and again, they're all in hysterics. So he turns to one of the other guys in line and says, what's going on? And he says, oh, you know, we've all been in prison here so long, we know each other's jokes, so we've just assigned them numbers. So he says, oh, okay, I think I get it. 42, stony silence. So he turns to the guy and says, what did I do wrong? He said, oh man, it's all in the delivery. Well, that's the way Alan's paintings are for me. There are a number of issues that he has addressed, as has been pointed out, that are very much part of the history of post-war painting. Classic, the grid, the geometry, phenomenology, all of these issues have been addressed by a great many artists. But I don't think there is any other artist, for me, who succeeds in bringing them to life with such economy. So I wonder why that is. It's not something, I mean, as I say, it applies to Mondrian as much as to Alan, but the question of what causes this, you know, one to suddenly perceive that something has a life, an independent life of its own, as opposed to simply being a demonstration of a certain set of ideas. I think one possibility is the excess of information that the artist brings to the work. If in excess, I mean of its propositional content. I think that art historical writing is often forced to deal with this kind of propositional content because it's easier to translate into words and then to apply words to than the kind of mysterious mental chemistry that takes place between all of your faculties when you're actually looking at a piece of visual art. But an idea is no more a work of art than an intention is an action. In painting, the formation of a visual idea in the process of making. That is, the idea doesn't exist before that process. The idea in the process of making is how the magical transformation from idea to experience takes place. The transformation from something being described to you to something that's actually happening to you. That, I think, is especially powerful in works that engage with the thinking about phenomenology that came along with minimalism, but it's certainly not restricted to that kind of work. No artist that I can think of was more aware of this particular alchemy than Alan, who used this extraordinarily subtle material craft to suggest an absence of material, to create something that's like a purely visual idea without weight, a luminous visual idea. That way of communicating excess information in painting often takes place in material terms, in facture or viscosity, opacity and translucency. But however it's communicated, there's always something ineffable about it, something that just does not yield to description, to being reproduced in some other terms other than the terms the object itself presents. So that I could describe a painting like this for weeks, and still, if I asked you to make that painting at the end of that process, you would unquestionably come up with something different. So there's something magical about that I think almost everyone who's interested in visual art responds to. And that excess of information that enters the work comes not involuntarily. The artist is trying to invite that to happen, but it doesn't come by intention. It's something the artist can't prevent from happening most of the time because it has to do with the body of the artist, as well as with the kind of experience they've had. If you've been a dancer, you move differently from someone who hasn't been a dancer. If your fingers are long, you hold a brush differently than someone whose fingers are short. All of these very particular physical aspects of making things combine with the more often discussed intellectual side of the business to produce the final effect of the object. So I think of this quality in art as character. That's a homely little term, and I won't defend it, but I'll use it nevertheless. It can mean something very trivial. I went to the Picasso retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in the 80s. It occupied the whole museum. One of the most powerful visual art experiences possible, really. You wander from one gallery to another thinking, oh my God, he did that too? And so as I was leaving, two sort of club ladies were walking ahead of me, and one turned to the other and said, he was a character. That was unquestionably true about Picasso, but not maybe the deepest thing that might be said. So to say someone is a character is very different from saying they have character, so in the sense that I mean it in the sense of the whole person operating at a level that's partially involuntary in the production both of the material object and in the construction of the kind of metaphor that they end up using. It includes thinking and dreaming, dancing and stumbling, remembering and forgetting. The sum of the complete experience of the organism who is in the studio. But the question of the relationship of character and work is incredibly complicated. You would not want to go reading biography literally into someone's work. That's one of the more appalling mistakes that I think one can make interpretively. But I think a better example would be Proust's treatment of his fictional artist Elster in The Remembrance of Things Past, where without telegraphing that this is going to happen, you are encouraged as a reader to think of Elster as quite the twerp in the first volumes. And then suddenly he reappears some volumes later as a really great artist, as the master of the whole series of novels. So this fluidity and difficulty of interpretation of character, which we experience every day, trying to get along with everybody we know, is perhaps even more problematic in relation to reading the experience of an artist into his work. But that's what I'm going to do a little bit. Fortunately, I don't have much time to do this. Alan was definitely a colorful character, although he always dressed in black. I noticed that Alina and I have involuntarily had a little chromatic tribute to Alan in our wardrobe tonight. His friends were constantly imitating how he spoke and his gestures. And I think I have a little animation here for you. He had a remarkable gaze. But he was a very contradictory, an intensely contradictory person. I was first experienced this when before I met him, I wrote a review of a show he had in the early 80s. And I imagined this very tweedy Englishman as having produced these paintings. I thought of Leslie Howard, if that, or maybe, who's the guy in oh, never mind. I was trying to think of a more recent suave English actor, but you get the idea. Then I happened to meet him in Cologne, and I was confronted by this teddy boy in big, heavy black Doc Martens and pipe stem jeans and with the teddy boy haircut. And I was like looking behind him to see if I'd been introduced to the wrong person. And so the somewhat theatrical side of Alan, although it was a restrained kind of theatricality, not a self-demonstrating one, was very striking. He could be very angry. He had some I heard some very picturesque diatribes on numerous subjects. But he also was the person who made these lively and serene pieces. Beneath the rough exterior, there was a sorry, I probably should have stuck to the intellectual content. A very gentle, reflective person, the person that Medry McPhee was describing. I think that the simplicity and luminosity, the fluidity of meaning, and the simple magic of the paintings came from a kind of compression of his complex and intense emotional states into this very, very narrow formal language. Something like the compression of coal, generating heat. I have the phrase crossed my mind this afternoon that he was a secular transcendentalist. That's only one of the many things he was, but I think I'll leave it with that. we hitting the table now?
Yeah. So we should just do a quick mic check to make sure that everybody is
Okay.
suitably wired.
Am I
Okay.
wired? I'm not wired. I'm tired.
Suitably tired.
Suitably tired.
And because we're running somewhat short on time, maybe what I suggest we do is maybe start with a question, and then we can sort of segue into some things that I would like to ask or reflect upon based on the presentations. I have a lot of things that I'd like to talk about, but I think because of time constraints, it'd be great to find out sort of your responses, what you'd like to ask. Please.
You talk a lot about his engagement with the real world, yet a lot of your language dealt with formal qualities of the work, aside from a few personal anecdotes and the soccer images. And only because I know that he was a big Fall fan. I'm curious about Alan's relationship to Marquis Smith, because I never met Alan, but they're kind of interchangeable in my head. And they both clearly have a similar kind of work ethic. So there's my question.
Is that for me? I assume?
Well,
Okay.
I assume the U was a composite of all three, I think.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
actually, I know the two of you guys went and saw the Fall.
Oh, I definitely, did you? I did. Oh, yeah, no, I did many times, both in Germany and in New York. All right, let me say that Alan, most of the time, painted to music, but he would choose different music for different shows or different series of work. So perhaps there would be the Patti Smith series, or the opera series, or the Fall series, so to speak. And Marquis Smith was also a Brit, and I think Alan also related to that. Marquis Smith also did a lot of speed. Alan never did. They did not have that in common, if that's a sort of lingering question in the back of your mind. I just think that he found the man's, let's say, more skeptical view something that he respected and related to. And musically and lyrically, you know, the man, I mean, he was insane, and Alan really, I think, related to his energy and also his commitment and his ongoingness. You know, this was not a man who backed off, and no matter what, he really felt that it was absolutely sort of life and death to keep doing this. And again, I was totally unprepared for this, so I'm sure when this is over, I will say, oh, no, you idiot, you should have, you know, one of those things. But if that at all goes anywhere toward answering your, great, okay.
Can I just?
Yes, of
add to
course,
that?
yeah.
I think another point. I
This
was
may
really
prompt your esprit d'escalier.
merci. I was really struck by your comment about his work ethic and this idea of needing to put hours in and perform labor. And I think there's a class interest there that
that's right.
links him up with the Fall, because that's a big part of.
Right.
What
It's
they were
produced
about.
by the same post-war landscape,
Yeah.
or the landscape of post-war Britain, and very much. I think that I was going to suggest that the class and the relationship to labor and a certain kind of an ethics based on a certain kind of sociology of post-war Britain, I think is very much maybe is a more connecting, deeper connecting point than perhaps a superficial things like they may have looked alike at some point. Or
How old is Marquis Smith? I think he's younger than Alan. I don't think he's really a post-war guy so much as, I mean, Alan was a war baby.
He said to me several times, he mentioned the fact that his father had built fighter planes during World War II, and I think he was very proud of that as skilled labor. You know?
Yeah, my late father-in-law was a master carpenter. But I must say, too much, I mean, Alan was not the image of, he was not like a working class tough, not even close. He really was what's called in England, and all these things are very calibrated. He was genteel working class for absolute sure. He had an aunt who painted lantern slides. His other auntie painted and drew beautifully. His mother played piano. His aunt played piano. His uncle. I mean, there was music. They went to the river in the summers, and they had this lovely little house that they built. And I mean, he was not a tough.
No.
Not at all.
No.
So I mean, I just do want to clarify that. So, don't romanticize that.
Yes.
Teddy boy or
No.
hooligan.
No, actually, if anything, well, I always call him a hooligan. But if anything, actually more a rocker than a mod, although he had mod kind of fashion sense in a way. Yes. Yeah.
We'll take the question in the back.
Yes.
I like the way he's been described, this discussion especially, the importance of work to him. And I wonder, a number of times the idea of repetition was brought up in his work, and repetition and difference, which brings up Deleuze and it makes me wonder the importance he had in his everyday approach. Was his engagement strictly with the history of painting, the materiality of painting? Did he care for the conceptual discussions in the philosophical world or in the art world? Was he really just engaged in that project, that physically important, visually important project? Or was he going out of the bounds of the strictly visual phenomenology and material of the painting?
Yes and yes. And actually, I made a note to myself after you spoke, and I thought about this earlier, even before this. When Alan and I were first together, he was speaking a great deal about the history of ideas in the 20th century. By this, he meant art ideas. And what I realized tonight for the first time, and I really would bet the farm, is that part of what Uglow was doing throughout, and this is why it's so odd. I mean, I've had people try to, of course, relate artists to other artists. No one invented this. I don't know who made the first scratch on a cave, but it wasn't Alan.
Debutatis.
There you are. There we have it. Now,
That is
thank
the foundational myth of representation, is the debutatis, whose lover traced her outline on the back of a cave in order to remember her after she left.
Oh, how interesting.
Yeah.
You know that Alan traced his outline.
Yes,
on
we saw it in
wall
the studio,
wall.
in the studio,
Yes,
yeah.
yes, but what I really do think he was in some way consciously doing, though Stephen's point is so well taken, all of the unconscious, intuitive, and he was a highly, highly, highly intuitive artist, despite the very precise so on. He was making reference. So in other words, people would say, oh, he's like Palermo, or he's like Mondrian, or he's taken from here. I think what he was really doing was consciously at times playing and appropriating, as it were, before the term really came into much use, various modes, but you could always recognize a Uglow. So, and mind you, I will also say this, what we are seeing, I am so happy with this show, with the standards and the portraits, and I never do speak for Alan, but as I said to João, I am quite sure he would be really happy about this too. That said, the man had a very wide, I mean, he painted various, without at all being all over the map, in the decades or in the years, he had various concerns. And it's not as though every painting resembled the standards or the portraits, not by any means. He did one painting using the Greek flag, but just turned it up. He did a series of paintings called barcodes that were actually taken from a barcode, which were also a pun.
It's interesting, the longest conversation I had with Alan was about Duchamp, which I still find very surprising. So it was a kind of meandering conversation about the ready-made, and about how the frame that, let's say, the ready-made allowed for a certain kind of appropriated act to be possible, but put an incredibly tight frame on what that would be possible. So that the gesture of appropriating the formal elements of, say, a coach's bench somehow struck one as being from a different place than a Duchampian gesture. And how that itself was already restricted. It was a kind of something that would have otherwise created an opening of the frame, which we've been talking about, which was one of the things I was going to bring up, actually constricted what could be included within the frame of painting. It didn't have the sufficient operation for painting that it did, say, for sculpture or for other kinds of practices, the Duchampian gesture, which is something he spoke at length and rather eloquently about. Sort of interesting, and it's in a reference that wasn't sort of evoked in our discussions. Sorry, Stephen.
No, it's okay. I just like to. Alan had a very distinctive way of dealing with theory. He was he was a very good listener, and he paid attention to things constantly, and was very observant. And so, whenever I had conversations of that kind with him, he was very shrewd about having kind of boiled down the discourse of the moment in a personal way, but very accurate. But he was definitely paying attention to what people were talking about.
And if I may say, I received a series of emails from a gentleman named Emrys Parry, with whom Alan had been at Leicester Art School. So Alan was 16, 17, 18, 19. And Emrys said, this is all a recent conversation via email. He's a Welshman who lives in England. At any rate, he said Alan was always aware, even back in the days in Leicester Art School, of everything that was going on. He made the point that Alan was always very sophisticated intellectually and in terms of his awareness of all that was happening in art.
We'll take another question.
Obviously, the relationship between the standards and the portraits must have been discussed a lot over the years, and I've seen them both before, as I think you know, and I've seen the standards in the 90s, and seeing them now again in this context, also come to think about Michael Fried and why photography matters more than ever, and again about the aspect of representation and in the abstraction, in the standards, where you have representation, but Fried speaks a lot about illusion and the importance of illusion in painting and why then relates to photography, and in a way you have that in the portraits. So, what's the beginning and the end here? Are the standards made to make the portraits? One could think about it that way, and obviously that's not the case. Another aspect of the dialogue between the two is obviously that you have this very subtle reference to painting in the standards, the marks, the different thickness of the paint, etc. Right. But when you then come to the portraits, that is sort of lost. There's yet another reality of the standards that may stand out as stark as the standards themselves.
I would suggest, though, that there is, just to because I think you're going in an interesting direction. I think what's interesting is we often forget that even the register of the portraits is the register of a printing process or of a hand. So the removal of the hand or the index of the hand. So there's a traditional, almost received relationship between the presence of the hand being an indexed for the artist's intention or the artist's presence. You look at the painting, you can see the move. You can see all the moves, or people talk about drawing as a register. You can really see the decision making. That in removing the hand, he sort of places the body in its place. And then there's the trick that you're suggesting, which is that somehow the printing process is seen as twice removed, but in fact there's gradations, there are printing mistakes. There's a sense in which you can see the hand where it's not supposed to be, and when the hand is removed, because the surfaces of the paintings appear to be hyper flat, almost impossibly flat. In fact, what you get is the body in its place. It's this funny thing. So, for example, one of the things that I talked to Alan about was my obsession with the fact that that standardization is not at all standardized. So, for example, the systems we use, the 8.5 by 11 paper. If anyone's ever, as I am, curious about 8.5 by 11, that doesn't make any sense. And of course, these things are residually related to, for example, the paper size being related to the width of a vatman's hands. So how much could you carry a plate, basically? So this distance, of an average distance, regulates the size of paper. It's related to the body. We see it as a standard. It's seen as a kind of bureaucratic procedural standard, but it actually is related to the body. Or the foot is the king's foot, right? So all these things that appear to be standards actually already have a kind of sociological, ideational, ideological, bodily relationship. And even printing has that, right? So I think it's interesting, but we often think there's a removal there, and actually there's a presence, and it's a problematic one.
The one thing that I noticed in looking at the portraits and spending a little more time with them was that I felt that I was able to see aspects of the standards through looking at the portraits, or at least to see accents placed on aspects of the standards in the portraits, especially the right-hand edges where the shadow becomes very prominent. And of course, you think of Warhol and other kinds of printing errors in the silkscreen history. But that is such a predominant element in the portrait paintings. And suddenly I start then paying attention, well, how far from the wall is the standard? I didn't know it was 8 centimeters. But then you go around and look, and I'd looked before, but it's just the relationship between the two. On the one hand, the portraits, as I mentioned earlier, are about withdrawal and withholding and the oblique angle and the sort of pushing away, but they also pull you in, and they pull you back. They pull you into themselves, but they pull you back to the standards. And so that pivot that I was describing earlier is kind of frustrating, but also deeply gratifying.
Well, you see this also when they're written about, that often there's these instances where people will say, well, the text will say, there was a blue painting, and then there was a picture of the blue painting. And they're not the same work, right? And so you can almost tell who's not looking, by doing that, because they appear to be the same painting, but they're in fact not at all.
But also, if I may say, though this, for what this is worth, when Alan first started doing the standard paintings, and remember, the very word standard has many meanings. A standard is a banner.
Right.
We have our standards, so it really, and he was very sensitive to language, but when he first put the standards on blocks, so if that first standard was on the wall, he didn't set out to do the standards. He received information from it and started playing. And people, by people I mean collectors in the main, gave him a lot of, the polite word is trouble, about taking these paintings and having them be on blocks. Paintings belong on the wall. My child will ride his tricycle into the paint, all kinds of stuff. So part of his doing the portraits, again, I don't think any artist is, every work is multivalent, okay? It wasn't this one idea. But truly, the first one that he had printed was the blue one. And he meant it as a blueprint because it is oblique, yes, but it is on blocks and it is on blocks. Okay? It's like, this is the deal. This work is on blocks. He actually, in Switzerland, he had a dealer in Switzerland for a time, quick anecdote, who called him of a day and said, Alan, I have great news. And Alan said, yes, And here is the point. He said, I've sold 6 standards, but it's a Swiss collector. And so he has to hang them on the wall. And that's just what we have to do. And blah, 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 blah. And as Stephen said, Alan was an excellent listener. And he listened. And he said, Joe, it wasn't Joe. That's good, Joe. Let me say that if they are signed, I am disavowing them. And if there are any that are not signed, I am not signing them. The paintings are on the blocks. The sale did not go through. The gallerist was not so happy. Alan just went on to the next work that he was working on that day in the studio. Okay? Now, may I say also, and I hope this came through from everything that Stephen said, Alan, I didn't even know this until after he was dead. And he didn't not tell me because I would have said, you what? No, he did not tell me because it would have been like saying, and I have 2 eyes. You know what I mean? It was not a big deal for him. He didn't pontificate. He didn't make a big thing of it. It's just like, no, this is the deal, and you know it, and so I'm sorry.
Take one more. Yeah.
Just really struck by the printing aspect here in the portraits, and I'm just wondering. Oh, pardon me. I'm struck by the printing aspect in the portraits, and I'm just wondering, if Uglow experimented with print portfolios and multiples or artist books, and if so, did they bear a specific relationship to painting or to these paintings?
Okay, well, first of all, one of Alan's advanced degrees was in printing, and he actually printed Jim Dine's brushes for Petersburg Press shortly after he got here. Yeah. So, and Alan didn't actually do the printing of the portraits. That was done by a man named Alex Heinrici. So that was large silkscreen printing. Alan did make a series of silkscreen prints in Boston with Genovese Graphics, and with that he was very well. He was with Alex also. I mean, he didn't just say, "Here it is, go to." You know, he definitely worked with him. He also worked a bit with Maurice Sanchez, Derriere L'Etoile. I mean, Alan really knew his printing techniques. And let's not forget Niels Borch Jensen in Copenhagen. Indeed not.
Yeah, very fine print.
Oh my God, they are so beautiful. It's such a beautiful. They were also very much destroyed. Anyway, yeah, no, Alan was really very sensitive too, and a very, very fine printer. I think that the again that edge, you know, because it was large format for for this particular gent or 2000 or whatever. It isn't that long ago. But, you know, he certainly went with the blur, and the reference has been made to Warhol, and as I say, who knows what he was playing with. I don't know if that addresses.
No, it does.
Okay, great, amazing, good.
And I also just wanted to just quote the fall song to bring back to the first question. Chairman Mao loves repetition. Jimmy Carter loves repetition. You know, there's that wonderful song from 1979, Repetition, Repetition, you know.
Right, but
yeah.
I just want to very quickly say again, Alan did do the standards and the portraits, and he did a series of paintings we referred to as low riders, but they were not all standardized except in the height and the general format. They're horizontal, low, and hung quite low. All his work was quite low and hung, well, not all, that's a lie. But the point is, those were the only series. He also did a lot of work that did not involve repetition. So just that's clear.
And so, not to repeat myself, I will, unless we have another question, I think we'll leave it at that.
Thank you all.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for your attention.